Chapter 6. Waking to a Nightmare. He'd been dreaming of rice paddies, of quiet streams, of knotted mountains beneath an endless black sky. He'd been dreaming of home. He sat on the floor, his legs folded beneath him. He watched his mother picking at the strings of her shamisen beside the open door, her back to him, her hair tied up in a bun, a few loose strands sticking to the sweat on her neck, the tangy music drifting in on the wind. Outside, pale moonlight fell on a stone path lined with sakura, cherry blossoms, their delicate pink petals falling like snow. His mother sang as she played. He knew the tune, but the words escaped him, like the details of the room, a house of memory. Still, he caught the tone behind the lilting notes, rising and falling with the melody. Melancholy. It was a song of mourning. She turned to him, her features mute, blurred, as if seen out of focus. Her lips peeled back to reveal a dark hole, and from the hole came a gurgling and then a bone-chilling scream. He awoke, the scream still echoing in his ears. No, that wasn't right. The scream had woken him. Someone was screaming. His eyes snapped open. More screams ripped across the hall. Chaos. A million things seemed to be happening at once, flashing and sticking in the jelly of his eyes too quickly for his sleep-addled brain to make sense of. I'm still dreaming, he thought, or how could he not be? Shadows were bubbling up from the floor, condensing into arms and feet and hands, into mouths, into shapes globular and grotesque, that waddled on misshapen legs, that dragged themselves across the stone, that oozed like oil, a menagerie of locomotion. And from the depths of that darkness there rose faces, bearing in their expression every humor, anguish and misery and terror and joy, faces that rose on a swell one moment only to sink again the next, to be swallowed up, to disappear, turning with the convection of that dark substance. Their mouths opened, wailing, shouting, laughing, sobbing, whispering indiscriminately, every conceivable sound foaming up all at once. But the sound, too, was distorted, amorphous, seeming at once close and distant, at once clear and broken, as if echoing from the bottom of a well. And as their voices issued forth, the shadowy forms surged forward like ink spilled across a page. Their hands seized, their mouths ripped. Blood drenched the floor. There was no time to think. Mitsue grabbed Krista around the waist and lifted her over his shoulder. He seized Rei's hand and sprinted for the nearest door. Confusion reigned. Children were dying all around them. Mitsue saw a boy lifted high by two deformed arms. The boy struggled and kicked his legs. Then, with a sickening crunch, he was ripped apart, his viscera showering the floor, drinking deeply the firelight. Mitsue slipped in a pool of blood, staggered, and nearly lost his feet. He looked down. Abbess Carmine lay face up, her glassy eyes staring straight ahead. As Mitsue watched, the darkness widened beneath her body, rising like water over her arms, her legs, her head. Without a single sound, she sank and disappeared. Through the door, then down the hall they ran, fresh screams echoing in their wake. Krista bounced against his shoulder, but otherwise she lay still, stiff with terror. The gas lamps here strobed, dying out only to catch fire again a moment later, plunging them from light to dark and back, so that sickly shadows danced in Mitsue's peripheral vision. Left, then right, then left again, up a flight of stairs. They pelted down corridor after corridor, the shrieks and howls tearing up the space behind them, the distance somehow distorted, so that it seemed as if all that noise were still just right behind them. Rounding a bend, they nearly collided with Ernley. He sat propped against the wall, breathing heavily, the left side of his face slick with the blood that didn't look to be his. He started when he saw them. "Help me," he whimpered. "My ankle." They saw that it was twisted beneath him. "I can't walk." "Barnes, floor it," Mitsue demanded. Wan-faced, Ernley shook his head. Mitsue set Krista down. "Here." He held her hand out to Rei, who took it. "You can't be serious," Rei whispered so that only Mitsue could hear. "His leg is broken. We can't leave him here." "He'd leave us." Mitsue knew it was true, but they were running out of time. Hating himself for it, he pulled Ernley to his feet, supporting his weight the best he could. It was then he noticed just how quiet it was. The screams, the noise, they died out. An unbroken silence had descended on the abbey. Mitsue, Ernley stuttered, raising a shaking hand. Mitsue looked where the older boy was pointing. His heart seemed to stop. Around the corner they'd just come, a shadowy hand now reached. huge with too many fingers. The fingers it did have were all different sizes and misshapen, as if formed by someone who had only a vague sense of what a hand should look like. Some fingers too long, some too short, some like small legs with feet attached. As they watched, it strained, sharp claws flexing, gouging into the stone, dragging its bloated mass into view, its dark body sluicing against the walls. From its back reached a dozen or more arms, long and narrow like crab legs. It turned its many faces towards them, its mouth opening. From the depths came yet more hands, sliding between the lips, swaying as if beckoning. There was a moment of stillness, a profound terror freezing all four of them in place. Mitsue could hear nothing over the thundering of blood in his ears. The Noctura, too, was still, facing them, if it could be said to face in any singular direction. Any second it would bear down on them, kill them, and yet... Why hasn't it? Mitsue wondered distantly, his sodden brain throbbing. They were right in front of it, plain to see, and yet the Noctura remained perfectly still. Slowly he craned his neck to look at Rei. She had Krista in a tight embrace, her hand clamped over the young girl's mouth. When she saw Mitsue looking at her, she held a finger to her lips. It can't see us, Mitsue realized. That was it. It had to be. The Noctura tilted sideways, as if listening, a sniffing sound issuing from its depths. It must track us by sound, by smell, Mitsue thought. Its many hands reached towards the gas lamps along the hall, extinguishing them one by one. What's it doing? Mitsue wondered. If it can't see, then how does it know the lamps are there? The Noctura snuffed out another light. How? He grit his teeth, and then it hit him. Heat! It could sense their body heat. Of course. That's why they'd gathered by the fire in the entrance hall. Against that blaze, the orphan's heat would have been invisible. But what now? When it finished with the lights, they'd be the only source of heat left. The Noctura extinguished another light. He could distinguish only its outline now, a stain against the darker black. What do we do? What do we do? Think! Mitsue racked his brain. Smell, sound, heat. Smell, sound, heat. The words tumbled around his brain. How could he use that information? Come on! He pinched his eyes shut. And then he had it. He slipped a pen from his pocket and braced himself, gauging the weight and the distance. He'd only have one chance. Wait. He'd need to throw it over the Noctura, through the outstretched hands. It wouldn't be easy, and there was no guarantee it would work. Wait. The Noctura smothered the last light. Its hands began to descend towards Mitsue and the rest. Now! Mitsue hurled the pen. It arced gracefully through the air and clattered off down the hall. The Noctura turned at the sound, listening, sniffing. Then, with a locomotion reminiscent of a caterpillar, it began to move away. Mitsue wiped the sweat from his brow. He nodded to Rei and the rest. Now was their chance. Ernly lifted his good leg and set it down, and as he did, a loud crunch echoed along the corridor. They all froze. Without realizing it, they'd ended up in that second-floor corridor. Fragments of the large mirror still lay strewn across the floor. A crack of laughter exploded behind them. Run! Mitsue shouted. They took off, Rei and Krista in front, Mitsue and Ernly hobbling behind, the Noctura flowing in their wake. Mitsue risked a glance behind. It was gaining on them. They reached a fork just ahead of it and sprinted down the left hallway. Unable to turn as nimbly, the Noctura slid to a stop behind them, its mass squishing together. Then, growing several sets of legs, it set off after them once more in a loping sort of run. Mitsue! Rei called. Up ahead, the hallway was swarming with more Noctura, their dark shapes coalescing and breaking apart, their voices raised in triumph and longing and misery. They surged forward like an amorphous tidal wave. In here! Mitsue threw open the closest door. He recognized the room immediately. Abbess Carmine's office. In the confusion, she must have forgotten to lock it. They all pressed through.